jeg har mine anelser, men jeg vet jo ikke, nei. Men jeg tenker jo at ikke bransjen alltid er så... Nei, jeg får litt sånn dårlig samvittighet, ja, av å handle på de store kjedene.
Vi vet jo sånn røffelig at ting produseres av underbetalte folk, men det er jo... Vi står jo ikke i en posisjon hvor det går an å få gjort noe andre valg, da.
Nei, ikke på. Det blir ikke laget noe i Sverige. Men ja, nei. Ja, det vet jeg ikke.
Jeg synes synd på de barna, forferdelig trist, og jeg tror verden går fremover på det. Men personlig så kjøper jeg det jeg liker ut ifra pris og størrelse. Det er nok noen som sier at de er bedre det de er, og så er det noen som sikkert er helt ordentlige på det. Men der er ikke jeg.
Når jeg fikk vite om det, så tenkte jeg, oi, men dette er jo ikke bra. Ja. Så jeg tenkte litt på det. Og jeg tenkte at noen har ikke lyst til å kjøpe de klærne da, som ble produsert derfor.
Jo, jeg kunne godt betalt 50% mer hvis jeg visste at de som gjorde jobben fikk de pengene.
Ikke så mye mer som det er da, fordi vi betaler jo egentlig ganske mye allerede for klærne.
Men altså, nå er tøy i Norge så billig at om vi hadde gitt 20 kroner mer, så hadde ikke det gjort noe. Men ikke fordi at Dressmann eller disse store kjedene skal tjene noe mer. De tjener nok. Det er de som er rike i Norge i dag.
Som dette, jeg husker da jeg var liten, så kom pappa og sa til meg, dette var jo på 80-tallet, og sa at den genseren du går med, den er helt sikkert sydd av noen fattige barn i Bangladesh, eller... Så jeg har liksom, det har ligget i bakhodet i alle år, at sånn det er veldig urettferdig og håpløs situasjon. Eller, ja, man kan jo gjøre noe som forbruker da. Stoppe å kjøpe på Hennes & Mauritz og tilsvarende. Det kan man.
So clearly there's something in what consumers have to say about our trust in the things that are produced for us, that we buy. The message from consumers, for those who don't speak Norwegian, was what we would expect. People are uncertain about what's going on in global supply chains that are producing our clothes, as they were asked about. Some said that they're willing to pay more to ensure that people get a living wage, that get a better wage. Others said that they weren't willing to pay more, or that they might be willing to pay more if it didn't simply go into the pockets of the owners of companies. Clearly, issues of quality, price, and ethics are in the minds of consumers, but the overriding sense I took from those street interviews was that people really are, consumers are unsure about what to do about it. So how can labor and business respond to precarious work in global supply chains? That's the topic for this session. My name is Mark Taylor. I'm a senior researcher at the Fafo Research Foundation here in Oslo. And I'm really happy to be able to welcome you here, also for those of you watching via the live stream. So the way we produce things is not just about us as consumers, it's also about us as workers. It's about jobs. The good manufacturing jobs seem to be disappearing. Either they're going somewhere else, they're going to a machine, certainly they're going to something or someone that is cheaper than you and me. Wage competition has been made possible by technology, sure, but also by the constant pressure of lawmakers who reduce barriers to trade. Trade liberalization has globalized the labor market. What were once national labor markets are now at least regional and in many cases global. Trade liberalization has contributed to a situation today in which the UN says 80% of trade takes place in global supply chains linked to transnational corporations. And that has transformed the power balance between employers and employees. The reality is that these global supply chains give corporations the power to decide how production systems operate, and the result for workers can be precarious work. Employment that is poorly paid, insecure, unprotected, or can't support a household. for many of the workers, in fact, a majority of the workers globally, this production system translates into poverty, wages, excessive working hours, unsafe workplaces, and repression of workers' rights to form democratic trade unions. All of this, because of the way we make things today, using global supply chains, has changed the relationship between employer and employee. So how can labor and business respond to this situation, to this problem of precarious work in global supply chains? How can we achieve decent work in global supply chains? And to help us answer that question, or at least to raise more questions in more detail, we're very pleased to have three excellent speakers here today. And I'm going to introduce them all briefly, and then I'm going to ask Jenny Holdcroft, the Assistant Secretary General for Industrial, to come up. Jenny is the Assistant Secretary General for a global trade union. For many years, she's led Industrial's global campaign on precarious work, living wages, and sustainable industrial policy. She's a member of the steering committee of the Accord on Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh, and negotiated the Memorandum of Understanding between Industrial and the global garment brands on living wages, collective agreements, and purchasing practices. So Jenny, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark, and hello, everybody. And I absolutely cannot answer those questions in 15 minutes for obvious reasons. But what I'll try to do is frame some of the problems and how we as a global trade union have been addressing them. I should say that Industrial is a fairly new global union. We were a result of a merger in 2012, bringing together the Textile, Garment, Leather and Footwear Global Union with the Energy and Mining Global Union and the International Metalworkers Federation. So what I'm going to really focus on is the garment industry. As you heard from the consumers, this is an industry that people relate very closely to, and it's the industry where most of the innovative supply chain work has been happening. But I was asked to frame this, this presentation in the context of trust, because that's the theme of this conference. And I think it's fair to say that there's very little trust in the way that global supply chains operate at the moment. There's very little trust that the multinational corporations that benefit are able to guarantee workers' rights. There's very little trust that the corporate social responsibility programs that they've had do anything. There's very little trust that unions have the right to organize. They don't. And there's very little trust that the governments in the countries that are producing in these global supply chains are able to protect the workers. Basically, is a lack of trusted institutions that can play their role. And this is very apparent in the garment industry. I'll just paint you a picture of why that is. This is a list of only Bangladesh garment factory deaths in the period from 2005 to 2013. And you'll recognize that 2013, of course, was the year that Rana Plaza collapsed and put a lot of global attention on these conditions. But this has been going on for years, primarily as a result of fires and building collapses. There have been massive numbers of deaths in the garment industry, and this has been an ongoing history. Death, of course, is the worst thing that can happen to a worker, but there's many other poor conditions, as Mark referred to, very low wages, very long working hours, very precarious employment. But what Rana Plaza did was it helped to focus the attention of the world on the issues, and I'll show in a moment how it made it possible for us to start to do some more useful things about this situation. But just while I'm on the topic of trust, just to illustrate why there was a lack of trust in any institutions to deal with these problems. This is a list of cases in red, which some of them were mentioned on the previous slide. People died, and in each of these cases, corporate social responsibility auditing had taken place and evidently failed to protect any of those workers. And this is not, of course, including all of the injured workers from those incidents. So, I mean, this is a very stark picture which helps to understand exactly why there is so little trust in CSR. So what Rana Plaza managed to enable us to do was to sign the Bangladesh Accord, which is unprecedented. There's never been anything like it, and there still is nothing like it. Over 220 global garment brands have signed the accord. This is not a multi-stakeholder initiative. This is not CSR. This is a binding, legally binding agreement between the parties to industrial relations, between trade unions and companies, but applied to the supply chain. It includes incentives for suppliers to comply with the safety provisions, and it provides sanctions if they don't. And we, as trade unions, can enforce the accord against the brands that have made the commitments under it. So having all of these elements I'm telling you are there because they have to be there. And what we've seen, and I can say it a little more confidently now after nearly 4 years of the accord, is that there haven't been any deaths in accord inspected and remediated factories. We haven't completed remediation. There's still a lot to be done, but there haven't been the history of deaths that we've seen on the previous slide. So it's working, but it is one element of worker protection in one industry, in one country, and it requires an awful lot of resources. But in terms of precedent value of how you address issues in global supply chains, this is the way forward, we believe, because it is a proper agreement between the parties to industrial relations, which is legally binding and applies across the supply chain. The other important theme that I'll come back to is that this raises conditions across an industry. And one of the problems, another accord slide, hang on, before I come to that. One of the problems that we face in the garment industry is it's very difficult for an individual company, even if a big one like H&M, to affect real change in the supply chains. We have some global framework agreements directly with individual companies, and a very strong one is the one that we have with H&M, which enables us to work with them to ensure that the factories that supply to H&M are functioning properly and there's access for the trade unions and all sorts of good things. But that individual company approach is never going to be enough to lift up standards in the garment industry. And that's why, and we can perhaps come back to this in the questions, the initial video about consumers wanting to know where can I buy my clothes, where is good, where is bad, doesn't really apply, because you've got factories that are supplying to multiple brands. And as soon as one brand starts to try and improve conditions, what do? They just do it for the production line that's producing for them, and what happens when they're no longer taking orders from that factory, and what happens when that factory takes its business elsewhere because there's another buyer who will pay more or will expect less of them. It's just not possible to do that. So what we've learned is that to be effective, we have to treat the systemic issues at an industry-wide basis. When you're talking about low wages, you're talking about long working hours, you're talking about precarious employment. These are systemic in the industry, and it won't work to do it factory by factory. And that has shown with the accord by bringing all of the brands together, by working collectively across the whole factory base. We're lifting standards and taking all of these issues out of competition, so they can't be undercut by other factories offering cheaper to the buyers, and they can't be undercut by buyers who don't care at all, and there are many of those coming in and undercutting those efforts. So that's what we've learned. So we're applying this approach to some of the other areas, and one of the most burning issues is, of course, low wages, and that's what I wanted to show you just as an illustration in this slide. There are many, many calculations that have been done like this, but it basically shows, and this is a nice coloured one, the problem about workers' wages. The wage part of that T-shirt is the yellow bit right at the top. That's the percentage of a T-shirt of its retail cost that goes to the actual worker that made it. And you can imagine making a T-shirt. The labour part is not insignificant. You know, you've got the cotton. But it's really the labour that's putting the T-shirt together, and you can multiply that into more complex garments that require more labour input. So I won't dwell on that, but just to show you this is an illustration of why it's a problem. So the problem with wages in the garment industry is there's no real institutions and structures to work on wages. The garment workers in many production countries, unlike a lot of workers, rely for their actual wages on the minimum wage in their country. So in order to lift garment worker wages, you have to actually lift the minimum wage, which is a heavy lift, and doesn't work. As you can see from this slide, and these are some of the wage protests of recent years around raising minimum wages. I mean, these are all our affiliates, and they have mobilised, and we have made progress. But like I say, it's a heavy lift, and there's problems with it. It delivers results that are too low. They're highly contested, and that also includes by the government, because it's the government that sets minimum wages, and they're not necessarily minimum wages that are specific to the garment industry. They would also apply across other sectors, so the government has to take that into account. And they're also very mindful of their country's competitive position in the global garment market. So, a particular country, take Bangladesh, which currently has the lowest, doesn't want to increase its wages for risk of being seen as less competitive relative to other countries that are also competing for business. So it's very, very problematic. The other thing, of course, is it doesn't address other wage-related factors. And when you think about collective bargaining on wages, you're not only bargaining for the wage, you're bargaining for the whole package of conditions, which impact also on the amount that you're prepared to negotiate for. You're negotiating on what hours you work, what other benefits there are, what's the sick leave like, what's the maternity leave like, what's the productivity, and how does that get passed on to the workers? Many, many issues which minimum wage mechanisms are unable to address. But critically, in global supply chain environments, there's no role for the brands. And this comes back to the question about what the people on the street were saying. If I pay more, well, as I understood from Mark's interpretation, I'm not pretending to have understood the original, if I pay more for my clothes, is that going to help the workers? Is that going to be passed on? Well, obviously the answer is no, because there's no linkage between minimum wage fixing here and brand retail price here. And as I said before, if you work at the level of an individual brand like H&M, if H&M raised its prices, would that translate into increased worker wages? And H&M have tried to do this. They have programs to try to do this, and it's just not possible. So it's pointless us making that demand on brands because we know they can't deliver it. What is lacking is a mechanism. So this is what we've been working on as a global union. We need a system that lifts standards across the industry. As I said before, you can't raise wages in some factories and not others because that just undermines the whole situation and keeps wages as a matter of competition, which they shouldn't be. We need a mechanism that enables workers themselves to be able to enforce the payment of the wage, that addresses all of these other issues that impact on skills and efficiency, and that recognises the impact of the brand's purchasing practices to ensure that that is factored in. So with that in mind, we have signed an agreement with these brands to start with. We expect that more will join. We've been working on this for about 3 years now. And the process is called ACT, Action, Collaboration and Transformation. And what it is trying to deal with are these missing structures that will give a mechanism for these good things to happen. And essentially what ACT is this. At its heart, it is developing a system of industry-wide collective agreements in garment-producing countries which are linked to the purchasing practices of the brands. And they need to be linked in two ways. Ultimately, they need to be linked in the sense that when there is a collective agreement in place, the brands will ensure that the conditions of that agreement are met by their suppliers. But even before you get to the point of having a collective agreement, we need the brands to ensure that their suppliers have the confidence to negotiate. In none of the major garment-producing countries is there industry-wide collective bargaining, which would enable these things to be done. So we are working with these brands to to set up such a mechanism. And for the brands to make this work, I mean, there's many things that have to be done. You have to create a legislative framework for it. You have to persuade people that it's a good thing and it's in their benefit. But ultimately, it's about getting more value from the supply chain down to the national level, so that you can't. The workers and the employers are both scrambling for the same small piece of the pie that they're granted through the pricing policies of the multinational companies. We need to make that pie bigger. And we also have to deal with the distribution of that pie at national level. So there's many factors there. But we need the brands to make commitments that will enable the suppliers to enter into such agreements. When we talk to factories about raising the minimum wage, and I've dealt already with the government's responses, the factories say, well, we can't possibly pay any more because we're not getting any more from the brands. They're squeezing us with their pricing. So we need to ring-fence wages in a way that ensures that the price that is paid makes it possible for the terms of the agreement to be met. But you can't do that without having the agreement in place, and that is what is entirely lacking. So we're trying to deal with this at a systemic level, understanding how the industry actually functions, and to find a way that will create a level playing field for wages, but also for the manufacturers, so that they can be sure that the buyers that they're working with will be paying a price and setting conditions, because it's not only about the price, it's about all sorts of, you know, timing of orders, etc., that will enable them to reach an agreement and to abide by those terms. So, circling back to trust, just to finish off, trust isn't something that really comes into this. We don't believe in trust. We believe in actual binding agreements that you can enforce. For the brands, it's more of an issue. They like to know that they can trust us, and it's because of the trust that we've developed through working through the Accord that we've managed to get them to voluntarily enter into this agreement, because of course people enter voluntarily into agreements, but then you have to make it enforceable to keep them there. So trust gets you to the table, I guess, but at the end of the day you can't rely on trust. You need to have something that's binding. So wish us luck, because it's a big job, and but we think that this is the best hope that we have of moving the bar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny. So up next we have Frances House, who is Deputy Chief Executive of the Institute for Human Rights and Business. IHRB is a leading think tank on business and human rights. Frances is one of the main brains behind the Institute, has been working on business and human rights for more than 20 years, and she leads the Institute's migrant workers program and engagement with different brands. So Frances, the floor is yours.
Thanks to Fafo for the invitation as well. I'd like to pick up really on where Jenny has left off in the focus on trust, or the deficit of trust in brands at a fairly catastrophic level in global supply chains. But to take a step back with the workers, talking about precarious work, of how the workers actually get to those factories or to their workplace in the first place, and what are some of the vulnerabilities that they're facing before they even start that job. So with those garment factories in Bangladesh, those will almost entirely be Bangladeshi workers, but many of them internal migrants from rural to urban areas. But let me just take you on a journey looking at migrant workers still, but international migrant workers and the vulnerabilities that they're facing, and then looking at what some of the leading brands are doing in terms of addressing their vulnerability to exploitation before they even take up their job. So if we could start in a small village in rural Nepal, high levels of poverty, very few job opportunities, significant numbers of the young men in that village looking for work elsewhere, and one of the main opportunities for work overseas to be earning higher wages than anything they could be earning locally or even in the cities in Nepal would be the construction sector. And there is a well-trodden migration corridor route from Nepal to countries like Qatar and UAE for construction. And so let's focus, for example, on construction for the World Cup stadia, Qatar 2022, that we've all heard a lot about. So that worker, to get to Kathmandu to the point where they can present themselves or are introduced to an international recruitment agency that has got an order for 100 Nepali workers to go and work on a site in Doha on one of the World Cup stadia, will have gone through several levels of sort of introduction to a second cousin's mate who has a local recruitment agency, and so on to Kathmandu. By the time they get to that recruitment agency in Kathmandu, they will already have paid several $100s worth of recruitment fees. Facilitation payments, call it what you will, without paying those fees along the way. There's no way they will get to that recruitment agency that's got the contract for the workers. By the time they're at that recruitment agency, that's when the big recruitment fees kick in, and that's where you find that a number of these workers, the vast majority of them, by the time they actually arrive on the construction site in Qatar, will have accrued anywhere between $2,000 and $6,000 worth of debt, which exceeds their annual salary very considerably. It will take that worker, on average, 3 years to pay back the debt, with the interest rates that are charged on that. So you have a system where there is bonded labour and forced labour on a massive scale going into certain industries. The construction sector is one that this is particularly prevalent. The apparel sector is another. Fishing. We've all read about the appalling conditions on Thai fishing boats, for example. A lot of Bangladeshi and Burmese workers on the fishing boats. So linking it back to the video at the beginning, consumers, the consumer awareness is growing in some sectors where there's a consumer-facing product at the end of it. So the T-shirts that we're wearing, consumers are asking, can I really be buying this for $5? Did anyone even get paid to make it? And that tiny percentage of labour is what we're seeing across this low end of the market. With the shrimps we're buying in the supermarket, not here in Norway, you're lucky, but elsewhere, you know, by and large, there is now an awareness. What's the modern slavery footprint on this product? With the mobile phones, the electronics, a lot of workers going from South Asia into Malaysia to the electronics sector. Again, very few parts of the global supply chain where this issue of forced labour and human trafficking is not a material business risk. Not to mention the enormous vulnerability to human rights exploitation that there is. So what can companies do? Jenny showed us that you know, the audits weren't catching the issues in the factories, and a lot of that was in front of their eyes to some extent in terms of fire and health and safety. When it comes to recruitment fees that workers have paid, the audits absolutely have not been catching that. And where you haven't got proper union representation or channels of communication for workers to voice grievances or to be asked even the right questions, you've got a situation where this endemic situation of bonded labour because of recruitment fees workers are paying has gone unnoticed for a considerable length of time. So there are a number of leading global companies that are addressing this. It's across industries, but it's really the electronics sector that's been out in front on this. And as ever, it's often when there's been an exposure in the media that's often the greatest catalyst for action on this. But we at the Institute for Human Rights and Business, our route into this, we developed about 5 years ago something called the Dakar Principles for Migration with Development that follows the route of a migrant worker all the way round from recruitment through the employment phase that Jenny has addressed, sort of back to either return home or onward employment at the end of that contract. So we've been focusing a lot over the last couple of years on the recruitment phase of this and looking at which companies have got any policies, actual policy commitments, and written into contracts with their suppliers, addressing this question of fees charged to workers. Because for us, it is the single most important issue for companies to be tackling bonded labour and forced labour in their supply chains, is to move towards a position where they're eradicating workers being charged fees to secure their jobs. So what we're promoting is something called the employer pays principle. It's an absolute no-brainer, and it's very straightforward. It's not easy to implement in the complexity of these supply chains that we know exist. But it is essentially that no worker should pay for a job, and that the costs of recruitment be borne by the employer. So there are about a dozen, not very much more than that, leading global companies that have an explicit policy commitment on that. So we're working with the likes of IKEA, Unilever, Marks & Spencer, Hewlett-Packard, HP, Coca-Cola, on the call to action to other companies within their industry and across industries to be saying this is something we have to take collective action on. So it's interesting, Jenny, again, talking about ACT and this question of business leadership, but businesses having to act collaboratively on this. This is not about competitive advantage. This is about raising standards across industries. But there is a cost to it, because although that Nepali worker could have ended up paying up to $6,000 for their job on a construction site in Qatar, the true costs of that passage to get the worker from their home country to their site of work, it's passport processing, it's health, it's jabs, it's health insurance, it's a plane ticket. It's almost always well under $1,000. It's depending on where it is. It's in the region of $500 on average. So you can see this massive disparity: the $500 true cost and the $6,000 that workers are being paid, and that's all profit that's being taken by the recruitment agencies. So what we're looking at is a sort of triangular approach to this, which is how can we, with these leading companies, increase the demand for ethically sourced labour? How can we be encouraging other companies to be adopting policy commitments to say we will work to the employer pays principle and we will work to eradicate fees in our tier one suppliers and then beyond? Because it's very interesting, the due diligence that companies will do on commodities and products in their supply chain extends far deeper down the supply chain than any due diligence that they will do in terms of how any workers in their supply chain are recruited. So an apparel company may well know which cotton fields in Uzbekistan the raw cotton comes from, but not how the worker who's in their factory was recruited. So we have to shine the spotlight more on that labor supply chain. So that's boosting the demand, and there are companies who are individually doing it. There are also some of those companies, so Unilever, Coke, Mars, Tesco, have all been working hard within the Consumer Goods Forum, their industry body, to adopt a new set of pillars which are about forced labour, and essentially they're about recruitment fees and retention of passports, which of course is the other facet of this whole forced labour scenario that we see. So individually and collectively, companies can, and a tiny minority, are beginning to act on this. But what we're finding when we talk to companies is, okay, supposing we shift to this, supposing we put it into our contracts with our suppliers, but we also, and we come up with some agreement around the cost sharing of this, the burden sharing. There will be a cost to companies to shift to this model. Where do we find the ethically recruited labour? Where are these recruitment brokers who are providing fee-free recruitment? And at the moment, that is a tiny, tiny industry, and that needs to grow commensurate with the demand that increases for ethical labour. So there are a few initiatives that are starting to invest, social venture capitalists who are starting to invest in the growth of ethically recruited labour. And the third part, just to finish with, is the advocacy with government in sending and receiving countries, because absolutely critical to all of this, and it's back to trust, is proper regulation of the recruitment industry and proper licensing of recruitment agencies, so that brands who have made this commitment can be putting into contracts with suppliers saying, you are required only to recruit workers from license, here's a list of licensed recruitment agencies. And if we can sort of get those three sides of the triangle somewhat in balance and moving forward together, then I think we can start to see some scale and impact on tackling this question of forced labour in supply chains. Thank you.
Thank you, Frances. So finally, we have Camilla Hoeland, who's a researcher and trade union activist from Norway. Camilla is in the final stages of a PhD on trade unions in the oil and gas sector in Nigeria. And she's written and lectured extensively on social movements, trade unions in other parts of Africa as well. And Camilla also has a background with the LO here in Norway. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I think I wanted to pick up where Jenny left off on the question of coming to binding agreements. And you said somehow that it's trust that gets people to the bargaining table. I think it's actually power, and we need to look for power. Where is power? And I think just this kind of global supply chain thinking of power, there's a shift in trade union power where a lot of the agreements coming to the table now is actually pushed from the consumer side, not from the producer sides and the workers themselves. So that's just a note on that. And that's also leads me to the reflection I had in the break with my former boss, that when we had African unions coming to Norway talking about how did we end up in this society where we are now with all these kind of trust, also including in the work life and industrial relations, most of them were extremely interested in looking into history where we did not come from a place of trust. We came from a place of industrial relations that were extremely conflictual and ended up in an agreement, and that was based on power. And I think that has kind of lacked from the discussions early on today on where we are today and where that comes from. And that's my kind of entry point to being interested in African unions and what kind of power the African unions have in building institutions and types of trust. And I've been working specifically on Nigeria and oil unions. But I just want to say a few words on how does this back? That African unions are seen generally as weak, but they're also often feared, partly because they are powerful. One of the reasons they are powerful is that even though they're very small and have been more affected by globalization in the sense of liberalization of work systems than possibly any other continent, they do control the most important part of the economy. And whereas we often think of the textile sector, manufacturing, that has moved to Asia, that also moved away from Africa. So the basis in some of the strongest trade unions in Africa is at the end of the supply chain, producing raw materials in the mining and oil sectors. And you can see in the strongest trade unions in Africa, they're often based in mining, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and oil in Nigeria. And that is kind of an entry point. And this Swedish researcher is based his research in Nigeria and say that even though the unions are very, very small size-wise, in Nigeria we talk about 4 to 5 million organized workers in a country of almost 200 million people. And they do still play a significant role in fighting for democracy, anti-corruption, universal rights, citizenship, and issues that we've been talking about all day today about building trust in society. However, these sectors are also some of the most vulnerable to liberalization. That came first with the oil crisis in the 70s and the structural adjustment programs in the 80s. And it has been particularly targeted at these sectors. So just before I go to Nigeria and the Niger Delta in specific, there was a wave of protests in sub-Saharan Africa that very few people talked about, that was parallel to the Arab Spring. One of the reasons why it was not talked about was they were not about regime change in the same way as the Arab Spring was. But you could still see that in the countries with strong trade unions, the protests were more effective. We also saw that in the Arab Spring with the Tunisians, where the unions did play a particular role. This is from Marikana, just an illustration of how the kind of end of the global supply chain is the power base of change and innovation also in the trade unions. And this is from the Marikana mine workers. There's a lot of controversies and difficulties in it. But there's something new happening in South Africa around that. In Nigeria, we saw the biggest mobilization in the country's history, maybe apart from the early 90s. Both times the oil worker unions were absolutely key. Millions of people were in the street, but it was only when the oil workers threatened to shut down production that government called for negotiations. Secondly, that they actually did call for negotiation is first that matter of the power of the strike, the power of the unions to actually shut down or potentially shut down the flow of the economy. In Nigeria, 70% of the government's income is from the oil. Potentially, if 35,000 organized workers lay down their tools, the country stops. And the income to the corrupt elites stops. So, however, there was also a lot of criticism on that oil unions for not actually shutting down and for not taking the social responsibility that they were expected to, that they did historically, especially in the 1990s, where ICM, one of your former unions, had an international campaign on the oil unions that were imprisoned for playing the central role in democracy movement in the 90s. So what I was interested in was going down to the Niger Delta to understand more the dynamics and power base of the actual unions, considering the globalization process of liberalization, reorganization of work life, and that it's also an extremely conflictual and tense society building on all kinds of controversies and conflicts around oil and international oil companies. So it kind of comes back to the global. So, I'm sorry. If we go down to the Niger Delta, you can say you've gotten an extremely segmented form of labor force as a result of liberalization or casualization, as they would say in Nigeria, which is kind of a process describing moving from core permanent jobs with good labor conditions into precarious work. If we look back into the 80s and 90s, there was actually a growing tendency to have a trust system even in the international and multinational companies, where unionists said that the companies rolled out the carpet to have social dialogue system, build union-based labor regime, meaning systems where it was actually the unions that were expected to be part of setting the conditions for labor and workers at the workplace. Since then, the liberalization of reorganization of the workforce has escalated even further. So if we should categorize what happens of today in the labor force, I have to say numbers in Nigeria are extremely untrustworthy. But if we should use the numbers that we have and assume that they're more or less okay, we can say that there's about 60,000 oil workers, which is extremely low in that huge country, but still that important. There are estimates that 20 to 30% are expatriate workers. I don't think there's any Norwegians. There's a lot of Scottish. So if you go to Port Harcourt, there's a lot of tattooed Scots. They are not organized in Nigeria. They set their working conditions at home. That's something I would like to hear if Industrial ever discussed and talked about how to kind of work together, because as of now, there's no discussions between those kind of unions and between foreign workers and local workers. And this is not something I did research on, but I would love to do. There's also a lot of rumors that this also hinders the strike because they often control the most central production site. So even if the Nigerian workers go on strike, the foreigners will keep things going. And this is also tensions that we see in Ghana. And there's also a class division, which is also reflected in the union structure. There's senior workers and junior workers. So there has been a process where there's a tendency to casualize junior workers. And if some of the junior workers are kept in the company, they may be promoted to avoid two kinds of unions, not least because the junior workers are a bit more militant in their strategies. So, and this is described by the unions as a clear divide and rule tactics of the companies. But generally, the unionists say that the multinational companies are better when it comes to agreements, to have a social dialogue process, to actually implement agreements, and they have better working conditions. So one of the big contentious spots here has been local content. So the last 10 years, there's also been a nationalization process where especially the supply industry and production, what's it called? Is nationalized and given to not necessarily the production side, but the downstream side of the industry is given to Nigerian employers. This has been very important to the unions. Now it's backfiring because these workers or employers do hire more on patronage-based, clientelist, family-wise, and resist organization more than the multinational companies even. So in addition to this fragmentation of the workforce where casual workers, contract workers are very, very, very difficult to organize, and mainly on junior workers' side, you have this new national Nigerian work or employers that are more difficult to work with. And then you have third category, in addition to the subcontractors and contractor industry and labor broker industry, there's part of the CSR politics, that there's been a lot of pressure on both from communities, because a lot of the workers that are permanent and senior are not from the Niger Delta. They come from other parts of the country. So there's very little work or employment opportunities for local communities. So in CSR agreements between companies and community leaders, they also provide for employment. And some of these employment rules are extremely weird. You have chiefs now being labor brokers and in principle employers, which they completely avoid. And the workers also think of the multinational companies as the actual employers because they may do surveillance and security work of the pipelines. So if the chief don't give them their salary, who do they then complain to? Normally they end up complaining to Shell or the back company and not the chief, partly because the chief is often a dangerous person to be unfriendly with. And you also have in these communities available labor force that is just available when needed. They have often also been used against workers on strike to hinder the strike. So what a manager told me was that whoever has the upper hand, depending on if the unionist is from the local community, speak the local language, they may have the upper hand and get the support from community youth. Otherwise, it may be the managers who have that control. Just quickly reflecting on this industry being extremely global and by nature transnational, there is still very little transnational solidarity within the oil sector. It's growing and there's a lot of initiatives coming up, but there's no real cooperation within companies. And I know the Norwegians are also taking this up within the industrial, how to build intra-company solidarity and power. So I think that there's a lot of potential in building that kind of transnational power, but it's still in the early stages. I think I have 10 seconds left, so I don't want to do the details on that.
Thank you. Thank you. We have, so clearly something is happening. Systemic approaches, we've heard, collective action by business itself, by business and labor together, but clearly still challenges to collaboration between the two, the need for binding agreements, and I think some real questions around what works in terms of getting people to the table, keeping them there, and ensuring that things are implemented. I don't want to talk for too long. It was a really fascinating discussion. I want to throw the floor open. If there's a couple of questions, we have 10 minutes that we could take some questions from the floor. I see one right here, Kathleen.
Thank you. I'm Kathleen Jennings from Fafu. 3 really interesting, excellent presentations. I just want to ask Francis, this might be outside the scope of what you're doing or what you're able to talk about, but the recruitment and the kind of migration route that you described is obviously highly gendered, and you have very similar situations with women being recruited into care work, whether that's in national health services like in the UK or into more private arrangements, as well as into domestic service, which is predominantly privately organized, but through brokers, especially in the recruiting countries, where they also are essentially debt-bonded labor, but their labor happens in the invisible sphere of the home, which makes them oftentimes much more, even more precarious. I wonder if you can, if the sort of ways you're trying to work with companies can also be used in these sort of arrangements, and then especially where government health services, for example, are involved, like the NHS. What kind of regulations, how can you also hold local health services accountable for this kind of bonded labor and recruitment?
That's a great question. It is very gendered, and I think with regard to the women migrant workers predominantly into the health sector and domestic, obviously the Philippines is the country that comes to mind most of all, and arguably the government, the sending country government that has done the most to regulate. It's by no means perfect, but it's a lot further along in terms of regulation and enforcement of that regulation than certainly most other Southeast and South Asian sending countries. So, I mean, just in terms of taking the Philippines example, then in host countries, so the UK would be one example where our health service relies on migrant workers. Post-Brexit, it's going to be very interesting to know how any of us will, manage to get a doctor's appointment, frankly. But at the Philippines embassy in many countries, receiving countries where there are Filipino workers, there's a labour attaché specifically in the embassy with responsibility in part for welfare of migrant workers in that country. Not many of the other sending countries have labour attachés, to my knowledge, in key receiving countries that have got that remit. The domestic workers is not an area that we have engaged with simply because, in terms of leverage with the private sector, it extends as far as domestic workers within their own sort of expatriate workforce, which certainly is part of the remit, but it's very small. The ILO are doing some interesting work in that area around domestic work, but in terms of the vulnerability, that is probably where the greatest vulnerability is, because exactly as you say, it's hidden, and it is incredibly difficult to regulate. So I think that's that one is a huge challenge.
Jenny, if I could ask you a question before I throw out to the floor again. I mean, with ACT, you're really looking at trying to develop what you call that sort of system-wide or approach, an institutional response. Could you say a little bit about how that differs from, for example, global framework agreements, and maybe some of the lessons or comparisons between the two?
Well, they're really different.
Could you just explain
wouldn't really. Okay, so a global framework agreement, they've been around for some 20 years now, and they're basically agreements between global companies and global unions on an individual company basis, and they have various provisions, but normally they commit the company to observing the ILO core labour standards in their own operations and in those of their suppliers. So it's freedom of association, collective bargaining, forced labour, child labour, and what am I missing?
Sounds about right.
That sounds about right. Mine's gone blank. So they vary in their effectiveness. Some of them are really just on paper, but they were an attempt to go further than unilateral company codes of conduct by actually putting the unions into the picture and working with the company to ensure that those provisions are met. Some of them really only focus on the direct employees. For example, I was interested, we have a fairly new one with Total, but in the garment industry, it's all about the supply chain. That's very different from what we're doing with ACT, even though it's also a global level agreement, but the function of that agreement is very different. Hope that explains.
Please.
Thank you. Robin Waller, Chairman, Diversity in the Workplace. A very broad question. In general, is the employer side, independently of type of business, more active or more aware of and more committed to use time and energy to increase from their side the trust level versus the labor side?
Anyone?
I can do Nigeria. No? No, from the trade unions in Nigeria, they could say that there is an increased trust level and a good level of negotiations and dialogue in the core of those with permanent jobs, senior jobs, organized, etc., within the multinational companies. But they would also complain that the same company also deliberately outsource and use contract works exactly to avoid unions. So they would describe it, and Nigerian workers are angry, especially the junior workers who are the ones who lose their jobs, who go into contract situations, and say that they pull the rug out of their base, and they lose job security, get lower salaries. And I have to say there are also senior workers who are contracted out. But generally it's so they describe this almost in colonial terms of indirect rule, and so that's the no answer.
Francis, did you come?
I'd say, trust is probably not a word that's cropping up all that often internally within companies looking at these issues. It's driven consumer pressure, media scrutiny for sure, and what we found has been one of the biggest drivers recently for progress in this area is the UK Modern Slavery Act, where companies with a global turnover of over £36 million per annum who have operations in the UK are required to make an annual statement as to what they're doing to tackle forced labour and modern slavery in their supply chains, what steps they're taking. So it's not just British companies. And I mean, I think that trust will inevitably lead to some areas where there is an increase in trust, but I don't think trust is the initial driver.
This goes back to what Jenny said at the beginning. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, yeah, just to say, well, I think there's two problems. I mean, trust it's not really a driver, as has been said, but also the problem now is who's the employer? And this is, I mean, we treat the brands as if they're the employer because we think they're responsible, and the UN guiding principles say that they're responsible, but they say, well, we're not the employer, and then you see all of this myriad outsourcing arrangements to avoid employer responsibility. And in the context of the ILO, it's very difficult because what are called the employers in the ILO are not the multinational companies that we're dealing with, they're the members of the local chambers of commerce in the production country. So it's very complicated. Everyone's trying to avoid being the employer, because if you're the employer, then the buck stops with you, and nobody wants to be that person. So it's, complicated.
It's a moving target.
Yes.
It's a moving target. We need to wrap up. I'm sorry, but we're now eating into people's lunch. So please join me in thanking the presenters, and enjoy your lunch afterwards.
De generelt skeptiske til Europa. De skeptiske til innvandringen. De skeptiske til at det som engelsk blir nedvurdert, og jeg tror det kommer av historikken også. Kullgruvene ble stengt ned, stor arbeidsledighet. Man føler at man havnet utenfor, og at Europa ikke gir dem noe.
We also had almost the lowest percentage voting. So 7 out of 10 people who voted out, but I don't even think it was a majority. So I think people in Stoke have really been left behind a lot. I mean, when I grew up, there were lots of jobs. There was the pottery factory, coal mines, iron steel, and it's the same as any city where all the industrial jobs have gone. And what's left is low-paid service jobs.
I hvert fall når jeg snakker med folk, så synes jeg merker den rundt om i Europa like så vel som jeg gjør i England. Altså. Jeg har også vært i Parisen 50 ganger, og der har vi det samme der også. Og det mønstret der, det synes jeg er ganske skremmende. Det virker jo helt uvirkelig per i dag at det skulle kunne skje. Det må jo bli en slags til og med et vrengebilde av Carl I. Hagen, og jeg tror ikke at det vil slå an også. Vi har noen grunnverdier som sitter tungt inne, men vi så hva som begynte å skje rundt da grenseåpningene var og sånn, ikke sant? Hvor mye det begynte å brenne rundt om, og utfall og innspill og media og understrømmer, så det er klart det jo overalt.
Mennesker vil egentlig dypest sett ha et godt liv for seg og sine. Når de føler seg truet, oversett, sviktet, så begynner ting å skje. Og jeg tror det den store utfordringen for det etablerte samfunnsdebatten, politiske partiene, at jeg tror at man må rett og slett oppsøke mennesker som sliter, og uten å fordømme dem, prøve å forstå hva de sier. Når noen kommer og vil høre på deg, som for eksempel UKIP i England, eller en Gert Wilders i Nederland, han tar folks bekymringer, hvor berettiget de nå enn på alvor, og spiller på det. Kan ikke da politiske bevegelser, fornuftige mennesker sette seg ned og snakke med disse fortvilte menneskene og se om det en annen vei.
Never ask people to vote on a referendum. I think that's the moral of the story, because most people don't understand all the facts. The only good thing is, for me, the pound has dropped 30%, so I get a much better exchange rate when I go back. So beer and football is cheaper in England.
Thank you. I see there are a few seats in the front here, if anybody wants to sit. Want to come up? So, you saw the football supporters presentation discussion on the topic we have today. We've called the session Exit Brexit. And in this session, we hope to address the question of what is really going on in Western democracies today. Of course, we've seen growth in nationalist sentiments and populist parties before in Europe. But there seems to be something different going on right now. You see it in England, in the US, in the Netherlands, and France, for instance, among others. It's nationalist and anti-immigrant parties. They're not only increasing in popularity, but we see that their rhetorics are increasingly being adopted by mainstream parties and candidates. You see new population groups are increasingly being mobilized into the electorate, messing up, of course, all the polling industries and their ability to predict elections. And with this, also an increase in the populist and maybe anti-elitist sentiments and rhetorics in politics. And what scares me the most, perhaps, is what seems to be a deterioration in the trust in media. And now it's not only politics and ideology that's up for discussion. Now we are actually having the issue of what is the truth and what is actually the facts that are up for discussions in political debates. So, is this really new? And if so, what does it mean? Does it have consequences and relevance for us here in Norway? We've invited 3 brilliant speakers here today who will address this from different angles. First out, we have Øyvind Brattberg. He's a lecturer at the Department of Political Science at the University of Oslo, and he's one of our greatest experts on British politics. And he's told me that he will devote his presentation to the Brexit vote and the social discontent that this expresses. And he will also address how the British government is seeking to resolve this discontent. The second talk, we have Assistant Professor Alexander Alfonso. He's a professor in public policy at the University of Leiden. He's published in high-ranking journals on governance of labor markets, on labor migration, and on political parties in Europe. And today he's going to talk about right-wing populism and trade unions in Europe. And the third speaker, the last speaker, will be Assistant Professor Johan Christensen, who's also at the University of Leiden. His work focuses on experts and expertise in policymaking. And if you look at his CV, you will see that he has a background from European University Institutes in Florence, Stanford, and Leiden. But for some reason, it doesn't really mention that he also was a civilarbeider at Fafo some years ago. And this year, I know, gave him excellent insights into the working of copying machines. And hopefully, I think also gave him some interest in this relationship between knowledge production and policy that this was born here. Today he is going to talk about populism and technocracy in Europe. He will address how populist politicians reject facts and expertise, and how this gives rise to post-truth politics. And in his presentation, he told me he will try to look beyond this discussion to the more fundamental question, namely what the rise of populism means for traditional relationship between the elite policymaking and popular politics. So I'm really looking forward to these three presentations, and I'll give the floor to Eivind Brattberg.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a privilege to be allowed to attend this panel. I hope we can at least establish a few facts and ideas about the Brexit vote, although we'll have to restrain ourselves to some headlines rather than going in depth on all issues. I think I'll start by a quote, and please allow me to read from the screen because that screen is a little too small for me. If you're born poor, you'll die on average 9 years earlier than others. If you're black, you're treated more harshly by the criminal justice system. If you're a white working class boy, you're less likely than anyone else in Britain to go to university. If you're at a state school, you're less likely to reach the top professions than if you're educated privately. If you're a woman, you'll earn less than a man. If you suffer from mental health problems, there's not enough help to hand. If you're young, you'll find it harder than ever before to own your own home. I know you're working around the clock. I know you're doing your best. And I know that sometimes life can be a struggle. The government I lead will be driven not by the interests of the privileged few, but by yours. Now, whose words are these? Could this be Clement Attlee of 1945? Harold Wilson, 1964, perhaps? Any Labour Party leader to choose from? No, these are the words of Theresa May on the steps of Downing Street last summer when she entered the post as Prime Minister. Now, what is this all about? How should we interpret Theresa May's appeal to not only to the centre ground, but quite distinctly to the working class or to the struggling classes of Britain? It's not the commonplace ideas from a Conservative Prime Minister, but it's certainly part of the mandate she has given herself in the wake of the Brexit vote. The kind of social grievances that she would like to redress in order to bring people on board and to sort of to halt the wave of populism that has characterized Britain through the Brexit referendum. Last year could be seen, at least in some ways, as the year that liberal internationalism was rejected, not only in Britain, but also across the Atlantic with the presidential election. Britain is particularly interesting in this regard, at the forefront of globalization, in the sense of cross-border movement of goods, people, capital, and so on since the 1980s. This has been coupled with a deregulated labour market and increasing social liberalism, in the sense that you could live as you like to a larger extent than before, including greater respect for minorities, for different lifestyles, issues that we would tend to see as progressive. But then we're part of the liberal elite of the big cities, aren't we? Not everyone shares the attractions of social liberalism. There's certainly an undercurrent of conservative law and order, family values under the Brexit vote as well, which we'll look into a bit later. Brexit, the majority that voted to leave the European Union could be considered protest against at least some of these forces, certainly the first two. And we will try to establish why this is so and how the current government is seeking to sort of address and perhaps redress those problems. A couple of background issues, first of all. In terms of social inequality, Britain has seen a rather large increase during the 1980s, followed by relative stability since then across shifting governments. It is a full-fledged fact that the Britain of today is in a different place than the Britain in the 1970s as far as social inequality goes. I'm sure this is a well-established fact amongst the audience. This has in recent years been combined with a rise in migration, immigration more specifically. David Cameron, when becoming Prime Minister in 2010, referred to as one of his aims to bring net migration down to the tens of thousands, that is below 100,000 people a year. Currently, net migration in Britain is close to 300,000. So you'll have around 600,000 people leaving Britain every year. 300,000 people leaving Britain every year and 600,000 coming in. That is a net migration of almost 300,000. This, of course, includes all the European migrants as well. And that aspect of immigration is something you can do little about as long as you're part of the European Union. As long as you're a full-fledged member state and part of the internal market, you cannot really halt that immigration. And that has been one of the key drivers behind the rise of Euroscepticism in Britain. There is reason to ask what that rise in Euroscepticism was grounded in. And I think it's right to refer to Tory Euroscepticism. That is the Euroscepticism of the right in Britain. If we look at how the process unfolded before the vote, why the referendum was launched, it was to a large extent an internal debate on the right wing of British politics. That is within the Conservative Party as well as amongst the UK Independence Party voters and politicians. In the Conservative Party, there was the classic Euroscepticism based on the belief that legitimate authority resides in the UK Parliament only, and also the belief that the EU is a sort of an inefficient way of organizing international trade. It's a waste of resources. It's responsible for unnecessary regulation and so on. The point about unnecessary regulation is something that is distinct in British Euroscepticism in contrast with what we know in Norway or Scandinavia. When David Cameron launched the idea of a referendum, he referred to as one of his problems with the EU was the fact that European regulations would hinder doctors at UK hospitals working longer hours, ever longer hours. So it was the Working Time Directive that he was directly against in that regard. So whatever approach Fafo may have to the EU, attacking that directive might not be on the agenda, I should think, because it's an attempt to civilize the labour market. But precisely that idea is something that free marketeers on the British right would attack. So a democratic deficit and the inefficiency of the EU would be the sort of classic Euroscepticism within the Tory party. In recent years, there's been elements added to this that has helped cause the referendum itself. The sense of crisis through the economic crisis in the Eurozone, as well as the refugee crisis in recent years. Those developments have created a notion in Britain that not only is the EU inefficient, it's become a dangerous place, a dangerous entanglement. We'd better liberate ourselves from the sort of the problems of the continent. We need to get out of here, basically. That has been a key argument. And then, of course, the immigration numbers and the belief that in order to control our borders, to regain control of our borders, it is necessary to leave the European Union. Now, moving from that sort of prelude to the referendum to the result itself, there are a few observations that could easily be made. This is a map of the Remain majority and Leave majority across Britain. And I'm sure as a sort of visual entry to this discussion, it's fairly clear-cut. There are some yellow areas here where the majority opted for Remain, and the blue areas where the majority voted Leave on the 23rd of June. And I'm sure you're aware of the situation in Scotland, as well as in London, and also in Northern Ireland, key areas where a majority wanted to remain within the European Union. Now, if we break down these crude colors into regional numbers, we find that the highest Leave vote would be in areas not traditionally characterized by Euroscepticism. These are not the well-off sort of right-wing patriots that have opted to leave the European Union. These are rather the sort of the people in the post-industrial backyard of Britain, Northern England, Northeast, as well as the Midlands and Yorkshire, areas where the safe jobs of the industrial era have been replaced by poorly paid service sector jobs, if any jobs at all, in the modern international economy. And those voters in those areas were the ones most vocally against EU membership, those who wanted to leave the European Union. You'll find the same pattern if you look at social characteristics. These are a bit technical, the different categories, but if you look on the left-hand side there by the star, you'll see that education, in the sense of higher education or the absence of such, is one of the key indicators, key explanations at the level of voters why you would opt for Remain or Leave. And age as well goes into that pattern. And you'll find that the stereotypical Leave voter would be one living in a non-urban area. Surprisingly often, this would be either in the Midlands or in the north of England. These voters would also typically or stereotypically be white British, of relatively low education and high age, that is at least 50 years old or more. And with a party affiliation at the last election towards Conservatives or UKIP. Amongst these Leave voters, there would be a lot of traditional working class voters who have now left behind the Labour Party and their belief in the left as such, and have opted for a sort of, we do not approve of political elites, we do not approve of where the country is heading. We might support Conservatives or UKIP, and we're certainly voting to leave the European Union. Against these groups, you would find the stereotypical Remain voter, who would be people such as us, such as the majority of us, I should think, living in urban areas of mixed ethnicity, or at least living in a mixed ethnic environment, relatively highly educated, often young age or low age, and a party affiliation towards the Labour Party, Liberal Democrats, Greens, or in the Scottish case, the SNP. One of the interesting observations going beyond those social characteristics is the urban-rural divide that we have referred to. In London, this is taken to the extreme. You'll find that in the city itself, the Remain majority was very, very high compared with most of Britain and certainly most of England. And that even included relatively poor inner city areas, such as Lambeth, for example. 78.6% Remain at the referendum. That contrasts strongly with some of the suburban areas. To some extent, well-off areas towards the south and the west, but to the strongest degree towards the east, where relatively poor housing estates, white ethnic dominance, and so on are characteristics. You can see the same pattern if you continue from London into the Thames estuary. You'll find that the darker blue, the higher the Leave majority in that area. And it's like you've drawn a border between London itself and the areas outside of London, going east. And many of these areas, although they're not part of the north of England, they suffer from many of the same problems. Jobs that have been lost, job security that has been lost, certainly, a rise in immigration at the same time as people have seen decreasing wages, if wages at all, different challenges in terms of the stable neighborhoods and all that you would like to the kind of stability that was there in previous decades, at least according to the mythology about the honorable past that people seek back towards. Now, if these are the signals from the voters, how could it be cured? And could Brexit be of help of curing those ills that Brexit seems to be a symptom of? Now, leaving the EU will hardly change those economic structures that characterize post-industrial Britain. Britain will still be part of a sort of globalized economy. Britain, and as long as the City of London survives, it will also be a society with an unhealthy reliance on financial services and consumer debt. It will be an economy with an oversized service sector with low-skilled, low-paid jobs, unless something revolutionary comes out of Theresa May's government. And it will be an economy with a deregulated labour market, where the kind of race to the bottom that we've seen since in the last decade, since East European migrants started coming in, that is likely to continue, with or without the presence of East European workers. Now, with half a minute left, I think I'll just mention finally that there is an overarching dilemma in all this, at least if you're on the political right wing where the referendum originated. A desire to minimize migration, minimize the influence of the EU, minimize budget contributions towards Europe, but make an economic success of it nevertheless. You'd better have good friends in Europe if you want to achieve those aims concurrently. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you.
Hello everyone, thank you very much for inviting me. I will be talking a little bit about the football supporters we saw in the beginning in the video. I actually was quite surprised that there were Stoke supporters in Norway. It's almost as surprising as the fact that there are Stoke supporters in Stoke. What I will be essentially doing in this, in my presentation, is to try to make a connection between issues that people at Fafo work on, essentially issues of labor, labor market, trade unions, and the broad theme of this conference, which is the rise of populism, Brexit, the rise of populist radical right parties. I guess the main argument I will be making in my presentation is that many of the things we've been talking about, the rise of populist radical right parties, come down to one broader trend, which is a change in the political preferences of one specific social group, which used to be the province of both the Social Democrats and trade unions. So that, in many ways, what I will say echoes very much what Øyvind just said about the change in preferences of the working class. This is a graph that also echoes very much what Øyvind just said. On this graph, I've plotted the share of the UKIP vote in the general election in 2015 and the share of routine and semi-routine jobs in English constituencies for the general election 2015. As you can see, there's quite a strong correlation where the share of routine, low-skilled jobs increases in English constituencies, the share of the UKIP vote also increases. So that echoes very much what Øyvind has been saying about the core base of support of both UKIP and Brexit, but I think the correlation here, if we put the data for Brexit, would be quite close, is quite closely related. Now, an even stronger factor that explains also the Brexit vote and support for UKIP is the level of education. On this graph, I've taken the same y-axis, the share of the UKIP vote, but plotted against the share of people with a university education, a university degree in English constituencies. So this is data from the British election study, where the correlation is even stronger. This is data from the British election study that was released a couple of months ago. So we have quite strong evidence when it comes to the Brexit vote, also support for UKIP, that working class people who feel left behind, especially in the north of England, Stoke, for instance, which is the constituency where the new president of UKIP stood, Paul Nuttall, is really the core base of support of UKIP and also populist radical right parties in general. Now, why is this interesting? It's interesting because this core base of support, the social groups that have turned to the radical right and against the EU, used to be the province of the trade unions and social democratic parties. This is another graph where you can see essentially two broad trends. The first is, which is not very surprising for most of you who have followed this conference so far, is the increase in the electoral share of populist radical right parties. In this graph, I've taken that from the comparative political data set from the University of Bern, where you can see the electoral share of populist radical right and protest parties in 9 European countries. In the 1960s, it was essentially a very marginal phenomenon. You can see them increasing quite steadily, especially from the 1990s and onwards. Now the data is from, so that's data by decade, where you can see that, one, the average level of support for populist radical right parties has increased in general, and also the number of countries that are affected by this phenomenon has also spread quite tremendously. Now there are just, in Western Europe, there's just a handful of countries that don't have a real populist radical right party. That would be Spain, Portugal, and Ireland. Countries like Sweden and Germany were spared for a very long time now. Even now, Germany with the AfD has also a pretty strong electoral challenger, especially for left-wing parties. Now, this is one trend. The second trend is this one. So the kind of social groups that we talked about so far, the blue-collar working class, to use that term, used to be the province of the trade unions. They tended to be quite highly organized, and they tended to vote for the Social Democrats. On this graph, you see two variables. So that's the share of union density. So that's a proportion of workers who are a member of a trade union. The second is the share of these people who voted for Social Democrats, the electoral share of the Social Democrats. The tendencies varies across countries, but you have a very clear declining trend for trade union density. Scandinavian countries are a little bit spared because of essentially the Ghent system, which has tended to keep union density at a higher level. But Social Democrats have been, it's been essentially decreasing pretty much everywhere. Now, two tendencies. How do we know that these two tendencies are related or intersect? With my co-author Lynn Renwald, who's done quite extensive research on the electorate of both social democratic, populist radical right, and center parties, we've done some electoral research that looks at the share of working class people that vote for different party families. So Lynn is a specialist of class voting. This is a graph from her research with Daniel Usch, where you can see essentially a class schema developed by Daniel Usch that differentiates different types of occupations and for which parties they tend to vote. If you have a bar that veers to the right, it means that this social group is more likely to vote for this party family, whereas if it veers to the left, it's less likely. I would like to attract your attention to these two elements in the graph. So that's production workers and service workers, where you can see clearly that these are the two groups, together with small businessmen, that are also the most likely to support populist radical right parties, actually more likely than average than all other groups to vote for the radical right. Whereas the average level of support is about 18% for the whole population, production workers tend to support it by 35%. So that's almost double than average. If you look at the data for the left, and that's what is quite striking if you imagine really the blue-collar working class as being the core base of support of social democrats, nowadays production workers, so people in manufacturing, are actually less likely than average to vote for left parties. So here you can see pretty clearly a quite dramatic reversal in preferences of what used to be really the main group and the main core base of support for left parties in Europe. This is data for Denmark. Denmark is really a bit of a paradise for social scientists because they tend to have data about everything and over a very long period of time. So this is a graph that shows the share of working class voters, so as typified by the class schema that I presented before, in the electorate of both left and social democratic parties in red and populist radical right parties in blue. You've got two trends there. The first is that you can see the red bars diminishing over time. So we have a time series that starts in 1973. It declines quite steadily. What this means is that the share of working class voters within the electorate of left parties has been declining quite steadily to become quite clearly a minority within the electorate of social democratic parties. On the other hand, you've had the blue bars are increasing, which means that the proportion of working class voters within the electorate of radical right parties has been increasing. In general, in the overall population, the share of blue-collar workers tend to diminish, so you have a bit of a bell-shaped curve, but in general, in most European countries, populist radical right parties tend to have a higher proportion of blue-collar workers than social democratic parties. You can see a pretty similar trend in all European countries, with a few exceptions. This is data from France. We have upcoming elections in France. But here again, the Front National has a higher share of blue-collar workers in its electorate than the Socialist Party. This becomes a real challenge for social democratic parties because the electoral survival of social democratic parties basically hinges on their capacity to mobilize new groups of voters. The working class is turning their back on them, so they have to mobilize new types of social groups that tend to be what we would call, what most people in this room, I guess, as you said before, which in the class schema of Ush we would call socio-cultural professionals. Teachers, academics, doctors, healthcare workers, especially people in the public sector. If social democratic parties are not able to do that, they're sort of condemned to the fate of the Dutch Labour Party, which was really went through a quite dramatic electoral defeat in the elections a few days ago, which basically can be explained by its lack of capacity to mobilize these new groups, because they had better alternatives. GroenLinks, that's the Green Party, and D66, which is a kind of a liberal center, liberal pro-EU party, a bit comparable to the Lib Dems in the UK. So basically, the electoral defeat of the Labour Party in the Netherlands can be explained partly by its loss of the working class and its incapacity to mobilize these new groups that most other social democratic parties rely on in other countries. Now, one question that one might ask is if populist radical right parties have become the party of choice for the working class, do they advocate policies that are in line with the preferences of the working class? There is some research, and that's data that I've used for another project based on the comparative manifesto data, where the red lines essentially mean the share of pro-welfare statements in party manifestos, and the blue lines mean the proportion of claims to retrench welfare. So basically, if you've got a lot of red, it means that the party is more pro-welfare, more left. If you've got more blue, it means that it's more anti-welfare. You have a pretty dramatic increase when it comes to France. You can see France in the upper right corner. That is essentially a change from a kind of liberal party. For instance, Jean-Marie Le Pen in the 1980s took pride in being called the French Ronald Reagan. Now his daughter is kind of advocating greater spending on healthcare, greater spending on pensions, taxing the rich, and is a very vocal critic of ultra-liberalism in general. So you have some evidence of a shift to the left when it comes to economic issues. Now, there's quite a big difference between what these parties say in their electoral agendas and what they actually do when they are either in government or in parliament. These parties claim are very critical of EU ultra-liberalism. They defend pension spending. That was, for instance, the case of Geert Wilders before he went to government in 2010, where he said that he would never compromise on one thing, and that was increasing the age of retirement. He did very well in the elections. What he did on the day following the elections is, finally, we don't care about that much, so it's not really a breaking point anymore, and we can still cooperate with the government that wants to increase the retirement age. So there's quite a great deal of difference when you look at what these parties actually do. Oh, here you go. Now, what happens very often, because these parties have to negotiate between the interests of their working class voters and also their traditional electorate, which is small business owners, kind of the traditional electoral base of support of the far right, that tend to be quite anti-tax. So it's quite complex for these parties to really negotiate between these two things, which leads them to betray their working class voters quite often when they come to positions of responsibility, which also entails quite important electoral costs, as the PVV as known in 2012, but also the FPÖ in Austria in 2002. Now, since I have 1 minute left, I think a good way to understand this shift of preferences and this kind of phenomenon whereby the working class has been turning its back on social democracy is there are two types of protection that you can provide to workers. The first is social democracy, which is really the kind of protection that social democrats and trade unions would propose. That's essentially compensating the effects of the market by some level of social protection, more spending, to compensate for the effects of the consequences either of labor market risks, of globalization. The other way whereby you can offer protection is what I would call national protectionism, which is closing borders, closing trade barriers, which is now the big thing that Donald Trump is proposing. And this change of preferences can be explained at least partly by the inability of left parties to credibly propose these earlier types of protection to the working class, which has led them to turn to essentially also a way that gives them the impression that they are protected, but via very different political means. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think the two preceding presentations have described very well the changes that are going on, the quite drastic shift towards populism that we've seen, not only in Britain but also in Europe more generally. So what I'm going to say I think fits very well, because it's more about what the effects of this will be for decision-making systems, right? So if we see these drastic changes in the political arena, what effects will that have on democratic decision-making in the Western countries? My point of departure here is something Guri talked about at the very beginning, namely that an important aspect of populism is this rejection of experts, rejection of facts, rejection of what's true. For instance, going back to Brexit, the British politician Michael Gove famously said during the campaign, I think people in this country have had enough of experts saying what's best for us and constantly getting it wrong. In the era of Trump, post-truth politics, alternative facts, fake news are things we hear about every day in the news, really. So there's been a lot of debate about this, but in my opinion, this debate has also to some extent overshadowed what I think is a more fundamental question, namely what the rise of populism means for decision-making systems more broadly. So has populism upended the traditional way of making policies in the Western democracies? And if so, how? So the more specific question I'd like to ask here is, how does the rise of populism influence the traditional relationship between technocratic policymaking and popular politics? And just to say this, I believe this is an important question because it will have implications for how Western societies will be governed in the times of populism, which is very much the topic of the conference. So what do I mean by technocratic policymaking and popular politics? Well, in democratic policymaking, you really have different aspects, of course. You have more technocratic elements and you have more popular elements. And by popular politics, I basically refer to electoral democracy. Political parties competing for votes, and based on the votes they get in election, gaining representation in legislative bodies. In this sphere, you could call it a sphere, what's decisive is the will of the people. So decisions should be based on what people vote and what they express their support for in elections. And legitimacy is very much based on responsiveness, so basically tending to people's concerns. Typical actors here would be political parties, but of course also different kinds of interest groups. But as you all know, democracy is more than that, and this is what I here refer to as technocracy. We could perhaps also say elite policymaking. This is of course fairly broad, but I think you understand what I'm referring to. This is the more technical side of making policies in a democratic system. So that means basically the decisions taken by permanent officials in ministries, agencies, by various kinds of experts, both within the public sector, but of course also the way academia, for instance, contributes to policymaking. Here the standard for a good decision is very different than from the sphere of popular politics. So you would say that the good decision is a decision that's based on sound and relevant knowledge, a decision that will have good effects, so a decision of high quality, and of course a decision that's also in line with rights, laws, and so on in the country. Legitimacy here is based not on responsiveness, but on responsibility. So basically the quality of the decisions that come out in the end. So here we can talk about what's often called output legitimacy, while in the popular sphere it's much more about the input legitimacy. There are some obvious tensions here, right? So you can take an example such as Trump's so-called Muslim ban. A majority of the population may want that ban. On the other hand, it might not be legal, and there might be no evidence that the ban will actually have the desired effects. That would be to limit terrorism and increase security in the US. Another example could be the question of EU membership. So in popular politics, the answer to that would basically be whatever the people want. If you look to from a more technocratic view, the question would be more, what are, for instance, the economic effects of staying within the European Union or of going out? Is it good for us? Will joining the European Union have positive effects? And you could base that on all kinds of different expert knowledge. So how is this tension resolved? Well, there are two sides to this, of course. On the one hand, the technocratic sphere or the elite sphere, to a certain extent, is loyal and accountable to popular politics. So, for instance, if you're a bureaucrat working in a Norwegian ministry, you're supposed to be sensitive to the political signals you get from elected officials. And there are also accountability mechanisms in place, of course, to make sure that the decisions made by unelected officials actually reflect the will of the government, for instance. But it's also important to remember that this is also a relationship characterized by delegation of decision-making responsibility. Think about decisions delegated to semi-autonomous agencies, for instance, and a relationship of autonomy, where bureaucrats are expected to behave also in an autonomous way vis-a-vis politicians. So, for instance, in Norway, we have this a very strong idea about professional concern, for instance, in public policy making, faglige hensyn. That's, for instance, a norm which very much belongs to the technocratic sphere. But that's a legitimate norm, for instance, in the interaction with politicians. So the question is then, how is this changing in the time of populism? How is the relationship between technocracy and popular politics changing? And obviously, I won't be able to answer that question here. I will not even attempt to do so. But what I've tried is to outline a few models for the potential relationship and how that's changing, based on some of our actual experiences with populism, which I think we often tend to forget. And I'll start with the Italian model. Some of you might have noticed that in the right after Trump was elected, they interviewed people on the streets all over the world, and in Italy the reaction was kind of, they shrugged, right? And of course, to Italians, the election of a political outsider who's a billionaire and who has a tendency to say outrageous things about women and his political opponents was nothing new. Silvio Berlusconi was elected president as far back as 1994 in Italy, and he's very much a populist politician, even if it's nominally a center-right politician. He's been in power for at least a decade over the last 20-25 years, and what's striking is that he would be a person who would be very attentive to the responsiveness part of politics. On the other hand, this has been a period characterized by political instability, the inability to address the problems of the country, and in particular, the inability to address economic problems, right? To the extent that at regular intervals, Italians have turned to technocratic governments. What in Italian is called governo tecnico, which they used extensively in the 1990s to pass necessary reforms of the pension system, for instance. Often described as a success story, but in fact it was basically suspending electoral politics, getting someone in government who would actually take the responsibility for making reforms, and then returning to normal afterwards. I have a picture of Mario Monti here. This, of course, occurred again a few years back when a technical government was appointed. And you also see this, I mean, if you look at the last 5 or 6 Italian governments, for instance, there's not one politician who's been Minister of Finance. They always draw their Ministers of Finance from the technocratic sphere. So they would be economics professors, people who worked in the EU or in the OECD. On the other hand, Monti, in particular, was extremely unpopular, and his role was also perceived as illegitimate. So this was in no way a cure to Italy's problems. And you've seen very much a pendulum swing back to new kinds of populist movements. The currently biggest party in the Italian polls would be Beppe Grillo's 5-star movement, which is polling us at more than 30%. So what I would like to say here is that the rise of populism in Italy, at least, has had as its effect a very unstable relationship between popular politics and technocracy. And I think you could also say that it's been fairly dysfunctional. Populist politics has been allowed to run its course until things have gotten so bad that they've turned to the technocrats and the other way around. Another model is the Irish model. And in Ireland, they actually have a party system which is based on populism from the beginning. So the Irish party system is not organized along the left-right axis as most other party systems. It's organized according to the cleavage between the people who supported the treaty with the Brits and the ones who wanted complete independence in the Irish Civil War in the early 1920s. The result has been two big parties, both ideologically flexible catch-all parties who've basically done whatever over a long period of time. One good example of this is Charlie McCreevy. He's the old finance minister of Ireland during the so-called Celtic Tiger period, so basically from the mid-1990s onwards. These very ideologically flexible parties have stood across from a very weak administrative state. So fairly weak state institutions, also without a lot of the kind of professional competence that you, for instance, would have in some of the Nordic countries in the permanent administration. What's been the effect of all this in Ireland? Well, you saw very clearly during the last 15 years or so that the Irish state was completely captured by populist politics. There were absolutely no checks and balances on what the government did. So you know, whatever idea would pop up in Charlie McCreevy's head one night would be policy the next morning, and that's literally true. The effect was, Ireland was a big success story for a while, but that was, of course, based on policies that were not responsible, not sustainable in the long run. You had a huge economic boom that ended with an enormous economic crisis in 2007 and 8 and 9. So the second model, so the first model would be some kind of instability. The second model would be basically capture of the administrative system by the populists. Now on to the EU model, and simplifying a bit, of course, it's well known that in the EU, the European Commission, for instance, has very strong formal powers, while the accountability mechanisms and the democratic control is very weak and indirect. Often referred to as the democratic deficit, basically a lack of democratic legitimacy. At the same time, we've seen the rise of various anti-EU movements in a number of countries. This is a photo from the Netherlands where they say nay to the EU. How has the EU dealt with this? So the changes in the popular politics. Well, I think it's fair to say that the EU does not really have the mechanisms for including that kind of popular discontent in its policy making. Also because it's almost irreconcilable by definition. Much of the anti-EU skepticism. So here I think you could say that the result so far at least has been inertia. The EU has not been able to do much or change much in response to changes in popular politics. The final model I have is the Northern European model, and I'm then referring to Norway, for instance, Denmark, but also to the Netherlands in part. That is basically responding to populism by integrating populist party into the existing decision-making system. And I think the Progressive Party's participation in the government in Norway is a good example of this. So they come into government, they're forced to be responsible to some extent. But you could also think about external support, for instance, from the Danish People's Party of the right-wing government there. Or another form, this is perhaps maybe a fifth model even, that the regular parties pick up the political issues of the right-wing populist parties. The question then is, of course, what will decide in the end where we end up, in which direction we move. And I'm not going to provide any definitive answers to that. I think it's important to emphasize, though, that very much will depend on the interrelationships between these two spheres that I've outlined. So what mechanisms do you actually have for including new populist parties in old politics? How willing are populist politicians to be responsible, and how responsive is the technocratic apparatus? Thank you very much.
Presentations. I'll now ask the three presenters to come up. We have, I think, 10 minutes, a little bit less than that, for left on the program, and I've asked the three to comment on each other's presentation, so I won't take any questions from the audience. I hope you're not too disappointed. You can talk to them, of course, afterwards. You know, I've been interested in myself in developing economies and early democracies. And there you tend to be these elites, you know, that are really afraid of the masses and the working class, and they refuse to give up power to the working class. And, you know, the political history of Norway, you also have the same thing. You know, the working class is coming, and the elites are really afraid of the working class. And given from the two first presentations, what you're telling us is this is what we are doing today, isn't it? The elites, are we the elites who are refusing to give up power to the working class? And should we do something different? Are we struggling to keep our interest and our power? Or is it a problem? And if so, what is the problem in this? Is one of the questions that I am sitting on. If you could reflect on this, or whatever else you want to add to the debate.
I can give it a shot, certainly. I think as far as the British left and the British Labour Party goes, the main problem is in keeping its own electoral coalition together. Because that coalition straddles old traditional working class on the one hand, often socially conservative, uncomfortable with technological change and so on, and the young, outward-looking urban elite on the other hand. And how can you satisfy both those groups concurrently? That's a tremendous challenge. And I think the entire Brexit debate has placed the party in the worst of all places, because it cannot argue in favor of neither the one side nor the other. The Labour Party leadership didn't want the referendum in the first place, couldn't take a clear position on it, saying only that EU membership is on the balance a good thing, but we're not really interested in the debate. And then what you find afterwards is that a large part of the party's assumed heartland has voted to leave the European Union. Another part of its heartland, the young, urban, outward-looking and so on, have opted strongly to remain in the European Union. How do you deal with that afterwards? What the Labour Party has done is to just sideline itself more or less in the debate, so that the Conservatives and the government, they speak for the majority of British citizens, assumedly, and the Liberal Democrats have taken on the role as the voice of the 48%. And I think it's characteristic of European social democratic parties. Look at the Netherlands, as you rightly exemplified, and at the French elections as well. The dominant voice countering right-wing populism is that of the center ground. Macron in the French case, and in the Netherlands, a debate between the sort of center and the right-wing populists. No one remembers the Social Democrats anymore, and that is a problem. And it's characteristic of the social change that the left is unable to deal with, I think.
Well, I guess a big challenge for social democratic parties is how do you bring back working class voters within the fold of the kind of broad social project that they had in the past. And I think there are two strategies that you can adopt. Either, and I think that's a view that is quite prominent in the left, and I don't know whether it is true, is that you can bring them back in the fold by moving left economically. That's the people in the US who said that Bernie Sanders would have been the solution to Trump, because more left-wing policies economically would have brought all these voters back into the fold of the Democratic Party. I am not sure this actually works. And I'm not sure that working class voters can be convinced by more left-wing policies economically without doing something with the concerns about cultural change and immigration. I think the big problem was for working class voters in many countries that they tended to be essentially at the center of politics. They used to have a position relatively privileged, which is not there anymore. And if you look at Britain, actually that's the slide that you showed in the beginning, white working class children do actually much worse at school than ethnic minorities. So that's quite a big change. And I think all these changes is relative rather than their absolute position, which is not probably worse than ethnic minorities, but that's the relative change in relation to their position in the past. The other strategy is for left parties to move right when it comes to immigration and cultural issues. That's a little bit what the PvdA in the Netherlands has done by being very critical of free movement of workers, with the pressure of Eastern European workers on Dutch wages. If you do that, you're probably going to lose the support of all socio-cultural professionals, people like us, essentially, who are not going to vote for you anymore because they don't, agree with this kind of positions. So the big question is whether you can still keep these two social groups, this big social coalition with whose preferences have really moved away from each other, whether you can still keep them together in a sort of coherent project along these two dimensions, both economically and when it comes to culture and immigration.
Final word goes to you.
Very briefly. I think one final consideration is that responsibility can still be a winning electoral issue. And I think that's been part of the success of the Norwegian Labour Party, and in comparison to many other Labour parties at least, that it's still a very convincing and credible governing party, a party that takes responsibility. And you also saw that at the Dutch elections, with the big electoral winner being the sitting incumbent prime minister, who basically ran a campaign saying, well, things are going pretty well. We're able to govern this country. Give me four more years. So I think, well, perhaps that's an optimistic view, but being a responsible governing party can still be an alternative for Labour parties.
On that happy note, thank you so much for 3 really brilliant presentations, and there is some coffee out there for the audience.